Okay, welcome to today's webinar. Really happy to be here today with John Lash from Dark Horse Global. We're going to be hashing about some very, I think it's interesting. John probably does too. That's why we like getting together talking about this, but I think we'll have fun. We're happy to field your questions along the way. Consider this a much more of a dialogue than just a lecture. John and I will be peppering each other with questions back and forth, and we're happy if you do the same with us, so no problem at all. We have slides, but we don't have a lot of slides, and we did it on purpose because we wanted to make sure that we spend time discussing these, and we really hit the essentials in our slides, I believe, as well. So as a first order of business, let's do introductions. John, why don't you go first, and then I'll run through the roadmap.
Sure, happy to. So thanks everyone for joining, and thanks to Jonathan for agreeing to do this and collaborate on this. I'm John Lash. I work exclusively in the National Security Investment Reviews arena. So in the United States, that's known as CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, the regulatory authority that has oversight over national security considerations of foreign persons investing in US businesses. I work in all phases of CFIUS review, from assisting companies with understanding and navigating the process to acting as an enforcement agent on behalf of the US government. And I also sit on the board of directors of 3 CFIUS mitigated companies here in the United States that have ultimate Chinese parent ownership, where the US government, as part of their mitigation, required that a national security expert be placed on the board to represent the US government's interests. So I work a lot and interact a lot with Chinese investors in US businesses that may represent a national security threat to the US, and I'm very interested in this space. I focus my PhD research on evaluating the second and third order impact of national security investment reviews, and particularly as it relates to US-China competition. So looking forward to having this discussion with Jonathan today. So thank you very much.
It's great to have you, John. And I'm an international business attorney. I have lived in Hong Kong and China for 3 years. I'm in the States now. I speak Chinese, 2 dialects actually. And so I've been invested in China and Chinese things for more than half of my life now, over 20 years. So for me, this is a matter of, I love the Chinese culture, I love Chinese languages, I love Chinese people, and I'm cognizant of the fact that in my professional practice as a U.S.-based business attorney, doing business with China and the U.S., that there are no easy answers, no easy outs of any of this. And so I'm very happy to talk about things from my perspective as a practicing corporate attorney dealing with M&A cross-border, US to China, China to US, and also ancillary things that come up with other countries that are interacting with the US, because as we'll talk about in a bit, CFIUS is not limited to China-US interactions. I think we can all agree that at least behind closed doors, this was definitely pushed to the forefront because of US-China relations, but there are very few safe harbor countries and safe harbor investors. So it's certainly part of the analysis, no matter where you're doing business in the world, but I know we're primarily focusing on China-US today. So in terms of our roadmap, we're going to talk broadly about economic security as a component of national security. We're going to talk about CFIUS and what it is, what it does, why it does what it does, and why it's been so popularly in the news. About CFIUS and other national security reviews on investment. Then we'll take a step back and look more at China's perception of the US, and then we'll look at how the global order of the world is being realigned around China and the US. And then we'll talk a lot, hit some debate points about whether or not this is a good thing, why it's a good thing, or how it might be improved to as many countries in the world are still trying to grasp with economic recovery after COVID. So with that, let's John, why don't you start out and give us an overview on this, since this is your PhD thesis. I'm very much the junior Padawan here, but let's talk in broad terms about how we got here and why economic security is suddenly at the forefront of the national security conversation.
Sure. So this is a really interesting paradigm, which kind of, I will say, was formalized during the Trump administration. In the Trump administration's national security strategy, that was the first time that the US explicitly put in writing economic security is national security. The Biden administration has taken that same tract as it relates to concerns around economic security and the link between economic security and national security, noting that there are significant issues within the economic sphere, which falls under the jurisdiction of CFIUS related to national security and how the country remains economically competitive, technologically innovative, and what that means as it relates to national security. One of the interesting concepts I think arises here is how and if we should be bifurcating national interest versus national security. It used to be that, falling under CFIUS jurisdiction and being, an investment or a company that was, dealing with these regulations was a black and white, this is a matter of national defense, right? Thinking of ports, of, natural resources, things such as that. But what we've seen is this evolution into arenas, right? The most kind of popular one right now to talk about is TikTok, right? And how does TikTok potentially impact national security, and what are the factors? So what we've seen is potentially a conflation of economic security is national security. But what does that really mean? So now, instead of asking, when companies ask, do I have CFIUS risk in my transaction? It used to kind of be the exception to the rule to have CFIUS risk, right? Now, with the expanded definition of national security and the inclusion of economic security, technological innovation, technological competitiveness, clients are we're trying to define what isn't national security versus what is national security, and that creates a lot of issues for investors and for companies seeking investment, particularly when what we're looking at is, in some cases, the only investment they can get, or what is the most appealing investment from an economic standpoint, might be an investor from China. So it does create what can be perceived as somewhat of a chilling effect for investment here in the United States, if we're saying almost everything could be national security, right? Health security, climate change, innovative uses of technology, migration, education, like that concept of national security has become so broad, the social media sites like TikTok, that how do we address that in a way that is truly, a national security interest versus this is just fundamentally in the national interest of the country to remain economically competitive and to remain at the top of certain industries. And that's the paradigm that I find most interesting right now is, rather than saying what's in, we're now trying to define what's out. And that's really difficult for companies seeking investment. And I think that's extremely difficult for Chinese investors attempting to make, very legitimate economic investments into, key industries, and how to navigate that process. But where, by simply being Chinese headquartered, having Chinese investors, there's going to be this enhanced scrutiny. So to me, that this concept and this potential combination or conflation represents one of the most significant regulatory hurdles we're dealing with right now in the overall M&A market. And there are rumors, and I think the rumors are true, that there's a pending executive order, which is going to be an outbound CFIUS, which anticipates restricting US investment in China in critical defense sectors, right? And how that's going to be operationalized. So we'll have ultimately inbound CFIUS, which, like you mentioned, is not exclusive to China, but just tends to, affect China in unique ways. And then also this converse, which is we might be getting an executive order in the next 30, 60 days that postures an outbound CFIUS that's going to start restricting US investment in China. And what are the impacts there? What is the goal? and then what is the potential reality of what is going to happen. So I find both of those concepts extremely interesting to bring to the forefront of the debate. And I'll pause there to get your reaction.
Yeah, no, I think it's very interesting, and I actually have some practical examples of this. A lot of people, when they think about Chinese capital coming to the United States, they think that it's all government directed capital. And people who are China watchers know very well that Chinese, wealthy Chinese, no matter how they got their money, and even just regular Chinese, are looking for safe places to put their money. They want safe places, and so capital flight is a real concern. And in China, there's still a 50,000 US dollar limit per individual per year on getting currency out of the country, unless you have a viable economic transaction that's going on. So people who don't have, and even those who do have a viable transaction. So for individuals, it's very difficult to get money out. If you have a business entity in China, it can be easier, but everything has to be invoiced. It has to be stamped by the tax bureau, and then it has to go to the foreign exchange desk at the local bank. And there are 5 major Chinese banks, all very connected to the party with party oversight. So getting money out of China is a very difficult thing to do, but it is absolutely at top of everyone's mind. Partly because of good returns in the U.S. and not just the U.S. but many other places. You know, you've seen places like Toronto and Vancouver, real estate has shot up exponentially in value in the last 20 years. As many people from Hong Kong, as Hong Kong was turned over to China in 1997, and then people started to realize what would happen under CCP rule, and there was more capital flight and more talent. So this is it's been a problem in China for a long time. And so people who are in the US who don't have that understanding think that the Chinese coming to buy real estate in the US or coming to invest in a business is CCP directed, government takeover of all businesses in the US and all real estate in the US. And that's certainly not the case. And so I think taking a nuanced approach at this is extremely important. A lot of these people are my friends. A lot of them just want to have a place to park their capital, or they want, for instance, I have a client who became a friend many years ago, and he has an import-export business, imports mostly timber from the U.S., and that's because U.S. timber is well thought of in the Chinese stage, and so they need those raw material inputs, and so in order to progress in the business and make sure he had reliable supply, he started acquiring forest land in the U.S. in the Midwest. And so, he, as far as I know, no party ties, no party mandates, and he's really just looking for reliable inputs for his manufacturing business in China. So certainly, there are reasons to be concerned, and there are certain industries to be concerned in. And is actually, John, this reminds me of the analysis I do in the reverse when I have U.S. companies who are still trying to decide, do we go into China? Do we stay in China? How risky is our business model in China in terms of our IP that might get stolen? We have to look at the Made in China 2025 plan and those 10 critical areas where China says it wants to be world leader by the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party founding in 2049. So similar analysis of, well, what is not the party interested in dominating, right? What industries, and there are very few, really. I mean, you're looking at things like consumer wearables, but not something that would be technology wearable, right? So we're talking clothes, shoes, normal things like that. Those are very easy. Those are very, very easy things for me to say to clients that you have, very little chance of you being a national security risk in China, so you shouldn't run any interference there. Whether or not you're going to remain competitive in China by taking IP over there and not protecting it, or just engaging in bad business practices, that's another thing, another consideration. But it certainly is, it's part of the analysis of and it's interesting for you to talk about it that way, is what isn't national security at this point.
Right. And I think one of the interesting discussions there is, look, there are real national security threats that exist, both emanating from China and emanating from other foreign nations, foreign adversaries. There are definitively real national security risks. But like you mentioned, are there areas where the US could and should be collaborating with China, particularly based on their dominance in a particular space or domain, right? For example, the US is highly unlikely to be able to compete in renewables or clean energy. Chinese companies own almost the entire supply chain. as it relates to solar, as it relates to key rare earth elements that are necessary for the clean energy transmission. So are there certain areas that we do believe are relevant for collaboration that are actually in the national interest to further that level of collaboration versus looking at every industry as a zero-sum game? If you're dominant, that means we are not dominant, and what does that do to our position as a global hegemony, right? So I do think, again, I don't want to I want to be clear, real national security threats exist, right? So what is national security is very important, but not everything represents a national security threat, because once you start expanding the definition, then you can grab any industry, any investment, any individual, and put them into kind of that box and say, you represent a national security threat, therefore, restriction, ban, divestment, and kind of speak to those issues. But like you mentioned, we should be pursuing and facilitating and promoting legitimate economic investment, as well as things that are mutually beneficial, like, for example, clean energy, the shift to renewable energy, and things such as that. So I do think we need to get much more nuanced with that discussion.
Agreed. So let's continue if you're ready for the next slide.
Sure.
So let's talk for a minute about CFIUS. I think this was your slide, but I'll dive into CFIUS generally first. I've been through the CFIUS process several times now, only twice through a full, and I only had to do the what we call the declaration, which is a kind of the lightest review. So in the declaration process, it's still pretty invasive. So and like I mentioned earlier, there are only a few safe harbor countries, and those are even not guarantees. You still have to look at who is the underlying party that is that is doing business, that's doing the acquisition or doing. So think about it this way, and this is how I'll pretend like you are all my clients and I'm giving you advice as foreign investors, whether you're Chinese investors or anywhere else. You're investors, and that could mean you are investors. It could just mean you're a company that has has a presence in the global market, and you find some desirable target in the U.S. It could be direct competitor. It could be a supplier. It could be a distributor. It could be anything. So so in terms of what this looks like in a practical way in a transaction, and I actually have this coming right just before we got on this webinar today. I was talking to my team because we have a new client that is in Southeast Asia, not China, and they want to do a couple of acquisitions, and they're smaller dollar acquisitions, and I say like a couple $1 million each, so smaller dollar acquisitions, but they need to do this transactions, or they want to at least have them finished by the end of next month. And so if you know anything about the CFIUS process or anything about a government process, you know that getting anything done in 30 days with government oversight in any way is not going to happen. And so the reality of pushing timelines back is a very real thing to consider. And it's not necessarily something that anyone likes to think about. Everyone, when clients come to me, whether they're venture capital, private equity, or company doing something, an acquisition, no one wants to hear that, oh, we may need to run this by the government. Now, I'm actually a little bit, I'm not shocked. I guess I'm just kind of pleasantly surprised and not shocked, I guess, that other countries, when I say we need to have the government look at this, people from other countries say, yeah, or that makes sense, because that's what they're used to. And in the US, we're used to free flow of capital, free flow of ideas, free flow of business, right? If we want to ink a transaction on Monday and close by Friday, we can do that for the most part. And so this idea that now if you have any kind of foreign influence, foreign money, foreign directors, if they're not from the safe harbor countries, then we have to at least pause and consider the transaction and consider, like you said, John, what's national security? How likely is this to impact critical U.S. technology, U.S. infrastructure, or personal data? So, John, just a few thoughts from me on CFIUS. I'll let you talk a little bit as well.
Yeah, so generally on the CFIUS process right now, like the deal realities are, if you are an investor from China, you are absolutely going to get grabbed in the CFIUS process. Either you voluntarily do it, like Jonathan mentioned, with respect to filing a declaration, which is kind of trying to fast track things, right? A declaration, provides a decision in 30 days, or you do a joint voluntary notice and enter into the 45-day review and the 45-day investigation. It is sometimes unlikely, or I would say majority unlikely, that as a Chinese investor, you're going to clear in that 30 days unless the deal is really low risk, unless the target is a really low risk company. So you do have to consider, hey, we're going to have an increased timeline. So execution deal risk increases, right? Your execution risk, your timelines are going to be extended, right? You're going to consider all of these other regulatory covenants that you might need to agree to as a foreign investor, as a Chinese investor, that might impact how you're viewing the transaction. So I think in a lot of cases, 5-10 years ago, CFIUS was an afterthought, right? Where you're just like, oh, just button this up at the end or ignore this regulation altogether. Where now, if you're a Chinese investor, it should be at the forefront of your thinking to say, we need to start this process as soon as possible because we don't want, to deal with the timing or execution risk that we might have. So it's a very good point. And what I want to point out is Chinese deals get cleared. Like they absolutely get cleared and get done. A lot of what makes the news, right, is just the difficult ones, the deals that are blocked, the deals that are forced to divest, the deals that are abandoned. But the majority of deals are getting cleared. Overall, somewhere in the nature of 85 to 90% of deals under CFIUS jurisdiction will clear, right? There's a very small percentage that are actually going to face kind of a go, no go situation. And there's some portion, 10 to 15%, that are going to clear with mitigation. So Chinese deals can absolutely get done. They're just going to require a bit more of a sophisticated approach. Sometimes you're going to take poorer conditions, poor regulatory conditions under the transaction. You'll have some constraints, and often it will take longer, right? Because CFIUS has, either 30 days with the declaration, 45 with a joint voluntary notice, and then they can push you into another 45 days into investigation. So kind of at 90 days to take a look at your transaction. So it's really very important to consider how that process will play out and how it might impact your deal realities. Some companies, will say, we've reviewed the risk profile of the transaction and we're not in the mandatory filing arena, right? Because only certain transactions have a mandatory filing trigger. We're in the voluntary side of it, so we're just not going to file. And you're essentially daring the US government to find you, right? And the US government does have entire teams of professionals that seek out those type of transactions. In 2021, they sent out over 100 information letters from CFIUS, where ultimately it says, hey, we noticed you did this deal, care to tell us more, right? So they're kind of pulling you into the process. So it does happen, and it very likely can happen. So it is often better to be collaborative and kind of cooperative on the front end, because if you get one of those letters, you're often you're on your back foot, right? The government is reaching out to you. You're just starting that regulatory relationship off, sometimes in a bit of a negative way. So purely from a strategic standpoint, a deal making standpoint, you often want to approach it to say, hey, we acknowledge this regulation exists. We're going to tell you all about the target company, right? Who we're acquiring or investing in, what they do, what they might have that's sensitive, why it's not sensitive, right? Who we are as the investor, some details around that, what you intend to do post-transaction, right? This is going to operate as, a wholly owned subsidiary, somewhat independent. We intend to fully integrate them into our technology stack, and that's really important to us. We intend to pull the technology in country like, what do you intend to do? Those kind of setups are really important because those are the things that the government's going to be concerned with as it relates to the potential national security risk, right? What's happening with the technology? What's happening with the sensitive data of US consumers or US businesses? And what's kind of that level of access into the company? So very important, I think, to deal with those things head on, because it results in a much more positive relationship with the government, particularly as it relates to deal making. But as you can see from the most recent declassified report from Congress, right, which is released on kind of an 18-month lag. So the 2021 is actually the most recent unclassified report available. China became number one again in terms of filings. They really fell off in 19 and 20, but in 2021, they had the most notices again. So we're kind of seeing what is, I'll call it a resurgence of Chinese investment in the US that's falling under CFIUS jurisdiction, which should be seen, in my opinion, as promising, for companies who need investment, as well as promising for Chinese investors in saying, okay, a lot of deals are going, through CFIUS, and you don't see publicly many blocks, because a block would be made public, because that's an executive action by the president. So if there is a block, it will be very public, but we're not seeing a ton of that. So these numbers should actually seem like quantitatively positive if you are a Chinese investor in terms of, can I get a deal done? That answer is yes. You'll just have to address the additional regulatory hurdles.
John, we got a good question that I think will fit nicely here. Someone from the audience wants to know if collaborate but verify is the right approach to take whenever you have a deal with China.
Sure, and I admittedly I think that answer is yes. So very clearly stating, this is what we're doing. This is kind of pre and post what the transaction looks like, and honestly, in some cases right now, admitting that the state of play, the geopolitical state of play, is constrained, right? So saying, look, we might not be allowed to do certain things, and we're just going to address that on the front end, right? So kind of we often talk, and I often talk to companies about taking prophylactic measures, right? Everybody wants a board seat, but do you need a board seat, right? So different things like that. Like, I know you want it, I know you regularly get it, but do you really need it, right? Because if you don't need it and we can take that off the table, that might make the process simpler or easier to get through the regulatory. So I do see a lot of investors kind of taking those prophylactic measures and saying, oh, look, we recognize that post-transaction, we're going to need to localize data of US customers in the US. So let's just say we're going to do that now. We're going to restrict access to those individual customers or sensitive information or intellectual property. We're going to isolate that in the US and not provide access to it. We're not going to transfer technology, right? And we don't need to have a board seat. So I think in some cases we're really looking in an intelligent way to say, what is a must-have in the transaction, right? Like, what is the commercial rationale for this transaction? And let's work backwards and see if we can structure this in a way where we can actually collaborate to an extent with the US government to address what we believe the potential risk profile might be. And that might not necessarily be what you agree is a national security risk, but what the government's going to look at as a potential national security risk. So it's really about being honest in those situations and deciding what's a must-have in the commercial rationale versus what's a nice-to-have in commercial rationale. And if you do build that collaborative relationship, right, with the US government, your next deal will likely be easier. The deal after that will be, right, once you've set kind of procedural history in terms of we are a good actor here, look at what we've done historically, the cumulative effect of your transaction and your cumulative relationship does, impact how you are viewed, right? You've got that history, that prior performance of being a good actor, a positive collaborative actor. And I do think that goes a long way.
I think you make a good point, John, that there are real humans on the CFIUS committee. Like this is people with legacy, memory, who you interact with, and you're emailing back and forth, and you're having discussions about the right way to structure the transaction if you have to pivot at all. And so making sure that they understand that you also, on your side, your team, your advisors, your lawyers, your accountants, everyone understands why you are taking the tack you are with this transaction, because these have to be collaborative by nature. And I have a pretty collaborative practice. That's just how I deal. I want to make sure the deal gets done, and most transactional lawyers like me are the same way. But I think from a company standpoint, or from an investment fund standpoint, it's important that all of the lawyers on the deal understand that the goal is to get it done, and that everyone needs to be flexible, and that you may have to educate the other side if you are a U.S. company that's representing a U.S. company, or an advisor that's representing a U.S. company. There may be some flexibility and some things that you never thought you would need to deal with if you want to be able to get the deal done. This happens a lot in companies where someone wants to retire, but they're going to stick around for a while, and they're just looking for any seller, right? Or any buyer. They're ready to be done. And so if they're not selling wholesale to a fund, if they're just getting investment, there are many different permutations of the way that these deals can go, and making sure that they understand to have realistic expectations that they may need to stick around. They may need to have more oversight than they want at the end of the transaction, and that may be for an extended period of time until they can, until they can find someone to take their place. So this happens with small and medium-sized companies all the time. Larger companies, much bigger infrastructure and less of an issue. But I find that in my client base, this is a very real concern as the population ages, and a lot of founders want to be able to sell out at the end of their time. So, John, I'm curious. I've got a random question for you. How many people are there like you that sit on these reviews? That are part of that get an integral part of a company, an integral role in a company to deal with this oversight when there is a CFIUS concern. Like, are there a handful of you? Are there hundreds of you? Like, I'm genuinely curious.
Yeah, so I will admit this is a bit of a cottage industry. So it is kind of very specialized consulting firms and lawyers who do it. So, I would say from a consulting standpoint, maybe 15 to 20 firms who do it in some capacity or another, right? And most of the major law firms in the United States have a practice dedicated to CFIUS, and they're always ranked in the chambers, band 1, band 2, band 3, so you can kind of take a look at those. But it is a niche, a very niche industry. It was much more niche 12 years ago when I started doing it. It has become, like with any regulation, the more popular it is, the more people want to do it. There's an inherent profit motive to doing it. But I would say it is still difficult to find someone to sit on your board, or it is still very difficult for companies sometimes to find individuals to say, hey, can you help me operationalize these controls in an NSA in a way that doesn't, really hurt the business? What are we agreeing to? Those type of things. So it is quite a niche, and I know some of the people in the audience are probably Googling, CFIUS consultant, CFIUS attorney. So you will kind of see it. It is a relatively small cottage industry, but like you mentioned, it's the same way in the government as well. You deal with this high level, very talented group of a lot of the same individuals in case after case. So it is very important to build that rapport and build those relationships because those people relationships matter. The deal terms matter, and the realities of the deal really matter. But building those relationships is very important. But it does exist as a cottage now.
Interesting. Thanks. All right. Let's see. Let me know if we get to the next slide. I know my computer is. So are we now on how does this impact investment?
Not on my end. Yes.
Not on yours. Oh, okay. Yeah. It's just maybe it's just laggy. Okay. Yeah. So let's talk about maybe some of these key areas. I think we've covered some of the deal realities. How does this actually function out? How does it play out in an LOI, a term sheet? What kind of things might you need to have flexibility on? What about this first set of bullet points that you've got, John?
Yeah, so when people ask, what should I be considering or what might the government be concerned with, I often tell them to kind of focus on these areas first, right? What is the technology that the target has look like, right? Is it a technology that everyone already has, right? A tech that's in every other country, so it already has widespread adoption, or is it a technology that only the US has, or only the US and the UK have, right? How special is that technology? That will be heavily looked at, right? Because that'll impact whether the US government allows you to integrate that technology overseas or transfer that technology overseas. The second bullet, data protection and cybersecurity. Look, fundamentally, because the United States does not have federal data privacy regulations, like this to me could be solved if we passed legislation for US data, kind of like GDPR. But because we don't have that here in the United States, it is left up to other regulatory bodies to deal with, are you capturing US person data? What is it? Is it considered sensitive, or do we consider it sensitive? And then how are you protecting it, right? You hear this conversation a lot with TikTok, right? The data that they may or may not be capturing, what is done with it, where is it stored, who has access to it. So all the cybersecurity kind of around those components. And think of cybersecurity holistically, right? If you are a natural resource company, right, how is your SCADA system secured, right? So think of cyber as kind of holistic and affecting every industry. Product integrity, that is, my company creates this software or has this source code or gives you this product, and how after the transaction or after the investment are we sure that it's still being made without the insertion of malicious code, or where's the product being sourced from, that type of thing. Supply assurances are often a big deal, right? Where are you getting the key components of your products from? And if you supply that product to the US government, either directly to the US government or to a government contractor, if you supply your software hardware to Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, like a GovCon, is it ultimately ending up in a product that is going to the US government? And how can we be sure that the supply chain is secure? And how can we be sure that after this investment, you're not going to cut off our supply or somehow change the product, right? That's a big deal. And then the co-location one, this one I think is obvious to everyone, but are you buying something that is close by to something the US government cares about? The US government actually has a really great map right on Treasury's website that shows you, it's a really great GIS map that shows you, in a very strange way, where are all the sensitive facilities in the United States? The government has kind of mapped those on a map that anyone can access.
All of the non-clandestine sites, right? That's what I figured.
Right. The non-clandestine, but it's still very interesting to kind of use that map. And if you Google CFIUS proximity tool, it'll kind of take you to that map, and it's really interesting. The co-location issue came up very recently with an agricultural site in North Dakota. It caused a lot of kind of heartburn and across the industry, and many people probably saw this play out, but there was a Chinese investment in North Dakota, some farmland, and ultimately CFIUS concluded it's outside of our jurisdictional review parameters, right? Because there are specific parameters. Are you within 1 mile of X facility, or are you within 99 miles of X facility? This ended up being outside of CFIUS jurisdiction because it wasn't listed in kind of the key sensitive facilities, which did cause a bit of debate that played out a little bit publicly, more publicly than many of these do, around co-location. So this typically happens with farmland and then with renewable energy, right? Because a lot of renewable energy sites tend to be put in areas where nothing else is around. Think of like Nevada, Arizona, California. So you want to stick a bunch of solar farms in the middle of nowhere where it gets a lot of sunshine. Unfortunately, that's also where we tend to have built military bases in the same type of areas. So we often run into these co-location issues relative to those sites. But that's not an issue that companies typically trip over, because it's usually fairly obvious. How close am I to something that is sensitive? But the other issues, I think, cause a bit more concern for foreign investors.
Great. So, and just as an aside, everyone should go check out the CFIUS map, because it's really interesting to see how much government space there is, especially in the Western U.S. I mean, huge swaths of counties in Montana. I was kind of amazed at how much land is out there. So from a let's say from a fund perspective, investment, or looking at strategic partners, some things that I try to help people think through in terms of how they're doing, how the deal is going to be structured. And actually, this often flows both ways, right? So even if they're a U.S. company or fund looking to invest abroad, anything that results in control of the business, and control is a very loose term. Which basically means if you can influence things, whether directly or behind the scenes, that is control. Even minority interests where there are, you have oversight. We talked about having a board seat, but even just being a board observer or being a member, Let me see, John's help me out, John. Did that one go? We have impact investment now. Let me know if you see it. That one went too far. How about that?
I'm thinking you want to be on the general partners, limited partners, and strategic partners page.
That's right. Are you there yet?
Still on the prior slide for me.
Oh, that's strange. Okay.
Now you're on it.
Okay, so it's just like a 5-second lag apparently. So any kind of control, think about influence, think about, it doesn't have to be overt, it can be covert, anything that's anything that's structured around getting around this. You definitely need to be aware of that, because there are always going to be investors who want more information on an ongoing basis than what you may be willing to provide them. In terms of what, like a fund structure, most LPs don't really care about who the other LPs are in a fund, but certainly when we have CFIUS concerns, if there's something that could blow up a good deal may have to cause a fund to wind up early or divest earlier than they considered, they're going to be transaction costs, and there are going to be and all of these opportunity costs. So it's something to think about, certainly. If you are operating a fund, you are going to have to deal with those LP considerations. Deal structures means that we have to think about this very early. I think as the lawyer, it's my job to have it on the initial due diligence request list. So I'll send over a 10 or 20 page request list as part of a transaction, especially if I'm on the buy side or on the investment side, about what I'm looking for and what I need from the company that I'm going to be investing in. And that's whether I'm representing a US company or a foreign company coming to the States. And that it's not on. I've seen a lot of other law firms and good law firms, big law firms, due diligence request lists, and I don't see CFIUS on there very much. So it's something that owners definitely need to be aware of, and other advisors need to be aware of to make sure that it gets discussed. There's just you just need to get comfortable with sharing more, and that's a hard place to be in. We often, when we execute an LOI, we want to limit the scope of what's going on. We want to limit the scope of kind of reps and warranties we'll give about the data or about the information that we're going to be giving to the other side. And that might work for your counterparty, a foreign counterparty, but it's not going to work for the government. The government's going to ask. CFIUS is going to ask and ask and ask. And so, as John said earlier, it's going to be important just to make sure that you're ready for that experience. It's not a great experience, but you need to be ready for it if your company or your fund is potentially in the crosshairs here. Okay, I know we've got about 15 minutes left. So, John, tell me when we get to the Chinese characters. It keeps wanting to kick over and pause and pause. Sorry about this, everyone. So, John, can you see my Chinese characters yet?
Not yet.
Okay. Well, let me give you a little background on the way, because it's important. We're going to shift a little bit to the geopolitical considerations about how we got here, basically, and what it means. And we will provide these slides, by the way, so my incompetence you'll be free of my incompetence, and you'll be able to look at these at your leisure. It's important, especially for U.S. companies, to understand how U.S. is perceived right now in China. We can all guess at it, but it's better to get it from the party itself. And the party is the one that's controlling all, the dialogue that comes out from China. So let me get this. So there are a couple of Chinese characters, and those of you who speak Chinese, there may be some on the call, you'll be familiar with this. There's a Chinese game that we often call Go, which is in Chinese is called Wei Qi. And the Chinese word Wei, I gave you the simplified and the traditional character. You see the box drawn around as the border. That will help you remember that this character means encirclement. And encirclement is a term of art. It comes from this game, but it comes from many years ago in the Warring States period in China, which was 2,000 years ago. It was a long time ago. And there are many stories, and a lot of Chinese political thinkers look back to the Warring States periods and the lessons that they learned there. If you want a good book on this, Michael Pillsbury came out in 2015 called The 100-Year Marathon. And it's a fantastic explanation. He's former DOD in the U.S. and he was in China working with Chinese military, kind of as counterparties from the 70s onward, maybe even the 60s, a long time. And so you'll find it now that you've heard this word, you've heard me call it this term encirclement. When you are reading reports, especially if you get, you get any kind of local. I personally like the Nikkei, it's the Japanese version of the Wall Street Journal, basically. I like their reporting on China-U.S. relations, and you will see this term pop up a lot now because Xi Jinping likes to use it. Other political thinkers in China use it, and they talk about the U.S.'s intention to encircle China. And it's interesting because they don't talk about the Chinese intentions to encircle the U.S. So by building an ally base around and conquering once they're surrounded, basically, and that's how the game of Chinese Go is played. Japanese is very popular too, but that's the idea: is you're encircling the other player's pieces. I have an interesting anecdote from one of my current Chinese clients that probably a month ago, I had my initial call with them, and they knew about CFIUS, which I was very impressed because a lot of Chinese companies that I've talked to don't know about it. But they knew it by name, and they were very concerned about it. And the reason that they were concerned about it is that, and the interesting thing is, John, their company had nothing to do with national security. I'm talking like, I'll give you an example, like something as innocuous as like greeting cards. Okay, so like let's say this is a greeting card company from China. They have good traction here in the U.S. and they're wondering, is this going to be a problem? Are we going to be able to be here in the U.S.? Are we going to be able to exist? And I think the reason why they're concerned, one is just what they're hearing in China, but two is they're used to this Chinese, Weihai Guojia Anquan, Gonggong Anquan. This is the Chinese catch-all phrase that is in all of their laws. And it said, in the company law, in the employment law, I mean, every I don't know how many laws there are in China now on the books, so close to 200, I think. But they all contain this catch-all provision that says, oh, by the way, if you happen to be the kind of actor who endangers national security or the public interest, then we can do whatever we want, right? It's the catch-all phrase. So this is not even on the kind of, can we do a business deal, John? Can we do investment? But they're used to the government having such far-reaching powers to say that if you don't play by the rules and we deem you a threat to national security or the public interest, you're done. We can do whatever we want to with you. So that's the context that they're coming to us with. And so it's kind of it just made me think about CFIUS in a whole new light, in the way that they see us and how they're projecting their own experience onto their U.S. The U.S. business plans. You have any thoughts, John? Or I'll try and go on to the next slide while you comment if you want to say anything.
No, I completely agree with you, and I saw a question in the chat around areas CFIUS will absolutely say no to vis-a-vis China. So I would say the highest risk transactions would be anything that explicitly goes into the defense industrial base. That's typically a bright line as it relates to China. Outside of kind of defense industrial base type industries, I'd say you're just looking at somewhat average risk. But the U.S. government's extremely focused right now on semiconductors as well, which has been pretty broadly put out there, AI type applications. Where it used to be you could focus exclusively on kind of the defense industrial base, anything in kind of innovative tech in the US should be considered fairly high risk right now relative to China. And by fairly high risk, I mean you're just going to need to proactively address these issues. The CFIUS concern or national security concern cannot be an afterthought. And CFIUS is coordinating with other nations' regulatory authorities. So particularly on inbound investment, right? The US does collaborate, right, with other Five Eyes countries. This particularly is relevant in the UK, as the UK has bolstered their national security review process. So pay close attention to that, meaning, CFIUS can go extraterritorial, which has also become increasingly unpopular on a global lens, but CFIUS moving extraterritorially to grab transactions, in Europe, specifically in the UK, if it serves the US interest. So being very careful around that as well.
Yeah, I agree on that. Let's switch gears for a minute. We're taking Q&A now. If you have questions, feel free to keep submitting them in the chat. We'll go right up to 30 after the hour. I like to think about the geopolitics a lot. I didn't realize that I would have made a fantastic geopolitical scholar, just because I love all this stuff. I was afraid of the math initially, so it took me a while to figure out the math wasn't that scary. But I kind of, this is my hobby horse as a business attorney, is to think about the realignment of the world order around, especially now around these two massive economies, U.S. and China, and I'm especially interested in the way that countries are lining up around them, and those I'm particularly interested in the emerging countries that have a lot of clout and will have more clout, but that won't necessarily take sides. John, so I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but it's kind of generally, I like to think about, I often have clients that say, we want to go somewhere, we need to get out of China. I'd say COVID broke all of us mentally, physically, emotionally, right? It was just a hard time for everyone, including supply chains. And so everyone saw the issue when you saw a shipping container going from $3,000 a container to $25,000 a container during COVID. Everyone said this is a bad thing, and we had ships lined up the port of LA miles out in the ocean. Everyone said this is a concern. We have to retool this some way. And so that COVID broke open the world. It kind of accelerated this issue that where China says we want to rise, U.S. says that's fine if you rise, but we don't want your politics. We don't want you spreading your politics around the world. We don't like the way you do business necessarily. We don't like the way you run your country. We don't want the rest of the world to be modeled after the way you're running your country. And of course, China doesn't like that. That would come back to the encirclement, right? China says we're just being persecuted because we advocate a different style of governance than the U.S. and its allies do. So when I'm looking at the world map, which I do multiple times a day, I'm looking at a redistribution of people, partly because we need people to labor, right? To the extent that we don't have heavy machines, we don't have machinery to do everything right now. We don't have AI running everything. We need people. We need people to provide labor. We need people to consume goods. We need capital. We need energy. We need infrastructure to be able to move things around, but we also need available land to be able to prop up infrastructure and more factories or whatever infrastructure we're going for. We need access to critical minerals, which are all over the world, and then we need countries that are willing to exploit those for whatever uses, and whether they're I always find it's funny that the rare earth minerals are earth minerals, but they're not really that rare. The rarity is finding a country that's willing to exploit, to degrade its environment to the point where it can extract them in a viable way. And China, of course, subsidizes all of its rare earth companies And so this is one reason why China has the stranglehold. And so coming back to the question, John, of how do we decide what is national security and what is not? And I think that's continually changing as we're developing new uses for these rare earth minerals. So do you have any thoughts, John, around the way that US and allies, maybe that list is changing, and China and its list of allies are changing, and what that could mean for how we can do business across borders?
Yeah, I do think that, there needs to be a very careful deliberation here, because, the Five Eyes Alliance, right, is extremely important for intelligence and military, right, as it relates to the US, Canada, and the UK. So, but with China being the #1 trading partner of most nations, right, outside of military support, China holds many of the economic or soft power purse strings around the world, and does have a significant amount of allies, or the enemy of my enemy is my friend type of relationships. And I think that's very important to consider, and particularly around the outbound CFIUS, like I talked about at the beginning, around the US restricting US investment in Chinese tech sectors, right, defense sectors. I would hypothesize the goal of that is to diminish funding in those sectors to hopefully slow down innovation. Now, my personal opinion is that there are countries who would be more than happy to fill that vacuum, and invest in China and take on those type of investments, that are allies of China, where, what is the net effect of that action actually going to be? Is it going to restrict and slow down innovation in those sectors, or will another country step in and fill that void? I think in many cases, other nations will step in and fill that void, and the investment will still be there. Those nations will reap those economic returns, as it relates to those partnerships. And does that actually put us in a better national security or national interest position? I'm unsure of what the answer is there, but I do think, to your point, we do need to take a close evaluation of the chessboard to say, where is the true power and influence in what is, an interconnected world, where military power or military support might not be the #1 consideration for many of these nations. They're more looking for economic support, and China's providing that in many cases. So I agree with you. I think the realignment is really important, and taking a hard look at who wields that soft power is very important.
And I'll share this bit here, and then we can go over any last discussion points you want before we end. I found this pretty instructive. The UN Human Rights Council is 47 countries, and there's permanent seats and rotating seats. And there was a resolution on whether or not they should hold this debate on what was going on in the Xinjiang region of China. And I found this to be a really interesting litmus test, kind of on which countries felt like they could do without China, which countries felt they were absolutely with China, and then those that abstained and said, we need the U.S. and China. So that's how I read this. That's how I read this right now, and it's interesting. Some, especially, you look at a Mexico and an India, countries where you think, well, they're definitely on the U.S. side, and that may be so from a national security or a country integrity standpoint, right? If China were to attack them, they would want the U.S. to come help, and vice versa. They may not be up for helping the U.S. to fight back China if China invades Taiwan, but they certainly want to be on the U.S.'s side for security purposes. And there are some, even like Japan. I thought it was very interesting because Japan is close, right? I mean, Japan and China certainly have a history, and they have a lot of interdependence, right? That the economy, the tourism. There's just a lot of cultural affinity, even though they have a rough history together. But I find it interesting which countries, and I'm going to keep an eye on this. This is kind of my baseline right now, and some of these countries have swapped out now. So I'm waiting for the next vote of something significant like this on the Human Rights Council that has something to do with China or Russia. And interesting to juxtapose this to the resolution that was passed, I think in February or March of 2022, about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And And there was a much smaller group of red countries that voted against, and basically sided with, with Russia on that, and China was one of those. So really interesting to see how this shakes out on the global stage. John, we may have one question here that just came in. If China can influence any company it wants, based on it being in the national interest of the Chinese law, then can any company be seen as a potential problem? And that's interesting. I think of it in terms of co-option, right? By China's national security law, every individual and every company is required to deal with the government, is required to answer questions, provide services, right? So I see it as a kind of ongoing threat analysis for the type of industry you're in, and also who your connections might be. I mean, China has a sprawling, just like the US, China has a sprawling spy network, right? They're always working above board, below board, wherever they can. And so I think that it's more of understanding where you fit in the overall risk analysis, where your company, the value of your IP, your people, whether or not you have politically connected people connected to your company, all of those things. China's interested in identifying and deploying all of its assets at any given time. I would say the U.S. is doing the same thing, but it's easier for Chinese spies to hide in the U.S. than it is for U.S. spies to hide in China. John, any parting thoughts? We're over time, but we'll give it a couple of minutes. I'm interested in your parting thoughts here.
Yeah, sure. And this actually feeds into what my parting thought was going to be. But any evaluation around national security has to be rooted in a clear understanding of what the concept is. What is it versus what isn't, right? And as we're looking at national security, is there both a capability and an intent, right? Capability might be clear. That is, can you do it? Do you have the resources to do it? But the intent is unclear. And to this question, can you infer intent of any Chinese investor simply because of the existence of China's national security law, which ultimately does mirror many of the laws here in the US, right? Our own companies here in the US must participate with many US lawful process requests, right? Our telecommunications providers have CALIA, right? They're much of kind of the national security components, I think have distinct parallels. But what is truly a national security risk that is a legitimate threat that we've identified empirically versus what is a theoretical construct of a threat? And where are we drawing the line on intent there? If intent is just, well, this law exists in China, therefore this could happen, right? If we're utilizing that criteria to identify or delineate intent, I think that may set a dangerous precedent around taking all Chinese investment and saying it represents a pervasive national security threat and not just a legitimate economic or legitimate commercial investment. And that's why I think it's really important to be able to work through these types of complex issues with a sense of nuance, meaning, how are we identifying capability and intent of the threat environment? So really important concept, really important question. And, I'm glad that was asked at the end. So thank you.
Excellent. Thanks everyone for sticking around. We may get back and do this again at some point later in the year, next year, as an update on once the 2022 CFIUS report comes out this end of this summer. So we're happy that you attended and hope you found it valuable. John, thanks a lot. It was a lot of fun to hash this out with you.
Great. Thanks for having me, Jonathan. Cheers.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye, everyone.